Good evening. Published in January of 1886, Robert Louis Stevenson explores the darker side of the human psyche in his Victorian classic, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. This novella follows protagonist Dr. Henry Jekyll and the troubling murder case of a man named Carew. This short yet startling classic quickly reveals to the reader that, quote, the creature who crept into my house, that was, on Jekyll's own confession, known by the name of Hyde and hunted for in every corner of the land as the murderer of Carew, end quote. What the reader is in no way prepared for is Henry Jekyll's confession that closes the narrative. Following the plot of the thriller with great anticipation, the reader soon discovers that Dr. Henry Jekyll is in fact Edward Hyde. Quote, at the sight that met my eyes, my blood was changed into something exquisitely thin and icy. Yes, I had gone to bed Henry Jekyll, I had awakened Edward Hyde, end quote. Stevenson's work is considered a literary classic as it masterfully exposes the depths of the human psyche. For while we often perceive ourselves one way, rarely do we acknowledge the dark depths we are capable of reaching. This duality exists not just within our own individual personalities, but also within our ideologies, our institutions, and especially our religions. Every religion, but particularly that of Christianity, possesses a dark duality that most of its practitioners are unwilling to acknowledge. Today, we have spent our time exploring Christian nationalism, and I want to thank Dr. Whitehead and Dr. Perry for their insightful empirical and quantitative data explaining Christian nationalism in America. And I'd like to thank Dr. for his definitions distinguishing between Christian nationalism and Christian patriotism, along with setting the stage for Adventism's practice of and engagement with Christian nationalism. Now, what is critical for us to understand is that this aim of protecting and perpetuating the narrative of America as a Christian nation, along with the government's critical role in maintaining such a stance and political agenda, is intimately attached to a dark and murderous duality that has manifested itself in global colonization and white supremacy. In fact, Tom Skinner, in an impassioned speech entitled Racism and World Evangelicalism in 1970, declared, quote, to a great extent, the evangelical church in America supported the status quo. It supported slavery. It supported segregation. It preached against any attempt of the Black man to stand on his own 2 feet, end quote. In this sense, white supremacy is the cultural, legal, theological, and political promulgation of the inherent superiority of American bodies included in the socially constructed category of whiteness. This thinking institutionally, interpersonally, and internally maintains the social order of anti-Black racism, xenophobia, and exploitive labor. Furthermore, Dr. Anthea Butler, leading religion historian and public commentator on religion and politics, in her recent book, White Evangelical Racism, The Politics of Morality in America, believes that Skinner's statement speaks to the dark history that many historians, scholars, and supporters of evangelicalism conveniently circumvent as they, quote, cannot or will not deal with the racism at the core of evangelical beliefs, practices, and political allegiances, end quote. In other words, at the heart of Christian nationalism is American evangelicalism and white supremacy. In fact, Butler writes, quote, racism is a feature, not a bug of American evangelicalism, end quote. This simply means that while many like to believe that white supremacy and Christian nationalism are 2 separate entities, that white supremacy is a separate evil that American evangelicalism must rebuke and dispel, Butler and others purport that the 2, in fact, are one. Like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, American Christian nationalism cannot be severed from white supremacy, and white supremacy cannot be severed from American Christian nationalism. I specify with the term American Christian nationalism as I acknowledge the space for nation states around the world to desire an integration of Christian values in their public and political sphere. It is the unique American manifestation of Christian nationalism that possesses deep connections to racism, xenophobia, imperialism, militarism, and exploitative capitalism that springs forth from the lifeblood of American white supremacy. This afternoon, my aim is to briefly reveal to you the evidence necessary to support such a claim. For American Christianity has purported and practiced a dark duality, acting like a lamb and speaking like a dragon, as so eloquently articulated to us from Jeff Rosario. And they have done this for approximately 500 years. More specifically, what I will reveal is the dark depths the American national psyche has descended to in an effort to practice their unique and duplicitous expression of Christianity. Reflecting on how "In God We Trust" is printed on all US currency, how citizens boldly declare in the Pledge of Allegiance that we are one nation under God, and how founding father and author of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, penned that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their creator with these unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, causing America to possess several references to this Christian God in her constitutional documents. On the surface, it appears that America is, in fact, a Christian nation. Historians and scholars are challenging this notion, suggesting that America is not a Christian nation and has never been. Instead, they suggest that America is a capitalist nation committed to manipulating Christianity to promote and protect its economic, political, militaristic, and social agendas, particularly their social order. One of the first historians to articulate such a belief was Frederick Douglass. In his narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, this former slave recounts, quote, "Between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference. So wide that to receive the one as good, pure, and holy is of necessity to reject the other as bad, corrupt, and wicked. To be the friend of the one is of necessity to be the enemy of the other," end quote. The author continues, declaring with vehement conviction the anecdotal evidence that proves his proposition. Quote, "I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, women-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial, and hypocritical Christianity of this land," end quote. Such an experience is not articulated with cursory reflection. In fact, Douglass further illuminates the irreconcilable duality of American Christianity by declaring, quote, "We have men stealers for ministers, women whippers for missionaries, and cradle plunderers for church members. The man who wields the blood-clotted cow skin during the week fills the pulpit on Sunday and claims to be a minister of the meek and lowly Jesus. The man who robs me of my earnings at the end of each week meets me as a class leader on Sunday morning to show me the way of life and the path of salvation. He who sells my sister for purposes of prostitution stands forth as the pious advocate of purity. He who proclaims it a religious duty to read the Bible denies me the right of learning to read the name of the God who made me. The warm defender of the sacredness of the family relation is the same that scatters whole families, sundering husbands and wives, parents and children, sisters and brothers, leaving the hut vacant and the hearth desolate," end quote. For Douglass, it is not just that the Christianity practiced in America is a poor representation of the Christianity of the Bible, but that the Christianity of this land is the primary vehicle that the American institution of slavery arrived upon, was enforced by, and perpetuated with. Once Africans in America were constitutionally emancipated from slavery, I say that because many African Americans now are in a form of enslavement through the institutional racism of mass incarceration, American evangelicalism maintained its belief in the inherent inferiority of Blacks in their theological teachings and their social and political actions. Historian Charles Reagan Wilson calls their post-Civil War efforts the religion of the lost cause. This was American evangelicalism's attempt at blending Christianity, Southern values, and slaveholding. Quote, "Pushing back against the destruction of their way of life, ministers deployed various methods to maintain the religious and cultural values of the slaveholding South during the Reconstructive period. By creating a history where the brutality and suffering of Black people was ignored in favor of promoting Southern life and chivalry, the lost cause essentially turned the states of the former Confederacy into defenders of a noble ideal rather than just violent secessionists that had defied the Union," end quote. This religious and political agenda joins with the American capitalist economy in the 1930s and 40s. Kevin M. Kruse, in his book, One Nation Under God, How Corporate America Invented Christian America, draws a seamless historical line revealing the ways in which piety and patriotism were intentionally connected as a means of opposing Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal. Roosevelt, an explicitly Christian man in his beliefs and speeches, purported a responsibility of the government to, quote, love God and not forget your neighbor, end quote. This brought on what many call the social gospel, or a kind of Christianity that was, quote, concerned less with personal salvation and more with the public good, end quote. American evangelist Billy Graham takes the national and international scene during this time and explicitly rejects the social gospel and proceeds to connect any religious affiliation to a public good to communism. This cemented American evangelicalism's fear of communism and the other. Understanding the connection between Graham's stark rebuke of communism is essential to understanding how he and American evangelicalism come to later reject the civil rights movement, and over the next several decades, any social movement focused on equity and equality, but especially concerning the races. By connecting communism to public and political social good, and particularly Black social reform, American evangelicalism stoked the fire of racist hatred and perpetuated the interpersonal and institutional manifestations of systemic racism and white supremacy. Quote, the threat of communism fit neatly with the idea of end times that evangelicals believed would bring Jesus back to earth. The threat also was useful in promoting the evangelical idea that individual salvation, rather than collective action, such as socialism or civil rights, would stem social and political ills, including communism. Likening the end times to the communist threat, Graham stressed the dual importance of personal salvation and resistance to communism, end quote. In this way, communism and socialism became synonymous with atheism and Black socio-political action. This is why American Christian nationalism always preaches, from the civil rights movement to the current Black Lives Matter movement, that any form of activism that seeks to press America outside of the social order of white supremacy is immediately attached to communism and is labeled as anti-Christ and an anti-Christian movement. Kevin Kruse records how this distorted gospel, rooted in American capitalism, maintains its lack of regard or concern for the disinherited, the vulnerable, or as Jesus identified them, the least of these. In the 1950s, James W. Fifield Jr. met with several politicians, clergymen, and business owners, and together they determined that government involvement in the care and uplift of the poor, vulnerable, and socially disenfranchised was problematic. Kruse writes, quote, in a forceful rejection of the public service themes of the social gospel, they argued that the central tenet of Christianity remained the salvation of the individual. If any political and economic system fit with the religious teachings of Christ, it would have to be rooted in a similarly individualistic ethos. Nothing better exemplified such values, they insisted, than the capitalist system of free enterprise, end quote. In other words, from the time of slavery through Reconstruction and into the civil rights movement, America has practiced and purported a kind of Christianity that institutes chattel slavery and sanctions the wholesale violence associated because of the inherent economic value of it. After the constitutional abolition of slavery, America simply reinvents their approach to amassing wealth through exploitation, but continues to justify such through perverted misinterpretations of Christianity and scripture. America and the Christian church's inextricable bond in their efforts of socio-political and economic exploitation remains the central beating heart that prevents either from extricating or dismantling the structural and systemic racism that exists within. For as Anthea Butler told us earlier, racism is a feature, not a bug, of American evangelicalism, meaning that racism and white supremacy is not an unfortunate minor irritancy to Christian nationalism, but is instead a central and foundational feature of its character and existence. It is the bloodline that maintains and drags American Christian nationalism down into its dark and evil depths. This historical reality is how Robert P. Jones, in his recent book, White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, is able to reveal historically and statistically that white American Christians are, in fact, the most racist demographic in the country. This is because white supremacy and racism are central tenets to American evangelical doctrine and Christian practice. This is what allows white Christians to support an openly bigoted president such as Donald Trump. Regardless of his 2 divorces, 3 marriages, sexual immorality, vulgar language, racist rhetoric, and blatant anti-Black, anti-immigrant, and labor exploitive policies, white American evangelicals not only voted, but excused his clearly problematic behavior. Declaring Trump as their president but not their pastor, contemporary white evangelicals did not find the inherent expression of white supremacist rhetoric and the litigation of white supremacist policies as antithetical to their religion or beliefs, because at the core of their belief system are these very ideals. It is American evangelicalism that caused white Christians to go to church on Sunday and make it home in time to lynch a Black man, cut off his genitalia and extremities for souvenirs, and take photos with the corpse to sell it in town as postcards. And it is the same American evangelicalism that justifies the caging of children at the border, the privileging of law and order at the imagined threat of Black bodies, and emboldens politicians like Jeff Sessions to quote texts like Romans 13:1, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God, and they quote this to justify every single dark and evil action. I close now. This is the truth we do not wish to accept or acknowledge, that American evangelicalism and Christian nationalism are inextricably linked to white supremacy, and they continually seek to maintain the social order of white superiority and Black and brown subjugation. For it continues to purport in the 21st century that whiteness possesses the divine right and mandate to rule and dominate all others. May we expose and rebuke this Jekyll and Hyde religion. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to begin my remarks with a quote from James Baldwin. He writes that, quote, white people are trapped in a history that they do not understand. If I were to title my remarks over the next few moments, I would title them Perpetuating Injustice, White Supremacy, Epistemic Addiction, and the Evasion of History. There are 2 interrelated theses that I wish to explore in my time with you this afternoon. The first is that white supremacy, endemic to white supremacy, and the project of American imperialism is an intellectualizing of the Christian gospel that is addicted to knowledge of the same sort that led to the fall of humanity. For even as Adam and Eve were admonished not to eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because God understood that human beings are not simply meant to know, but to do, the Christian church has in many ways, and in particular, Christian nationalism has in many ways engaged in an idolatrous evasion of history in an attempt to perpetuate injustice. And it does so theologically through an addiction to knowledge at the expense of morality. We also see in the evasion of history, and this will be the second point that I hope to show in my time with you, a disturbing and strange schizophrenic relationship with the political. Here, when I speak of the political, I do not speak of the partisan politics of Democrat and Republican, which I believe Christian theology ought to shun in many ways, but rather the political in terms of, with a capital P, in terms of a social arrangement of human beings under an authority that is empowered to make and enforce law. I've seen a lot of comments come up in the chat that spoke of the condemnation of Christianity and its involvement in politics. And again, if by politics you mean Democrat and Republican and independent and left and right wing, I get it. But there is a politics with a capital P that shows up from Genesis to Revelation, and Adventist theology is saturated in the political. For in Genesis, we see Adam and Eve, a community of two persons who are organized and arranged under an authority, God, who has the ability to make law, do not eat from that tree, and enforce it. The day you eat of it, you will die. Indeed, the interpretation of the image in Daniel 2 is but an unfolding of politics and political kingdoms in Western civilization, culminating in the utter destruction of unjust, oppressive political orders with yet another political term that we use that we call the kingdom of God. So what I hope to show in the next few moments is that first and foremost, we evade history, a history that, as Baldwin tells us, most whites do not understand. And second, the evasion of this history leads to a perpetuation of injustice, an injustice that we claim is so fundamentally morally repugnant to the Christian gospel, yet it is embraced because of our epistemic addiction, because of our addiction to knowledge at the expense of morality. If I had a biblical point of departure for the first thesis that I hope to show, which is related to the evasion of history, I would begin with Genesis 1:14. There we are told that God made lights and put them in the firmament of the heavens. And we're told further that God, in doing so, said, let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. And astronomers tell us that when we go out on a clear night and look at the nighttime sky, that when we look into the heavens and see the stars, we don't see them as they are, we see them as they were. They are so far away that their light is just reaching the Earth's atmosphere. And the billions and billions of light years that they are so, because they are so far away from us, we just begin to really see them. So when we look up in the nighttime sky, we are looking in the past. We are looking into history. And as if that were not enough, I ask you to step outside on a warm, sunny day. And as you glance up at the sky and you feel the warmth of the sun, know that you do not see the sun as it is, but you see it as it was 8 minutes prior. So we live in a world where we are literally saturated in history, a history that is at the core of the Christian gospel. For the critique of deism, which was the religion of many of America's founders, is that God is fundamentally uninterested in human beings, that he made us and that he withdrew. But yet the Christianity tells us something very different. It tells us that we serve a God who is so engaged with us that he joined the 3 Hebrew boys in the fiery furnace, that he joined Daniel in the lion's den, that he joined the Hebrews when they were slaves in Egypt, and that ultimately he joined us because as we were yet sinners, while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. So if God cares that much about history, to enter history, to become historical, to transition from the eternal to the temporal in order to save us, then we ought to be concerned about history as well. And yet there is a bizarre evasion of history. When James Baldwin says that white people are trapped in a history that they do not understand, I want you to take a journey with me. And I want to show you that ultimately the United States of America needs racism. It needs anti-Black racism in order to function. If there were no anti-Black racism in the United States, it would not be the United States of America. It would be something else. The first slaves arrived at Jamestown, Virginia in 1619. And from 1619 to the beginning of the Revolution, the so-called shot heard round the world was 157 years. And for all the cries of freedom and for all the cries of Patrick Henry, who said, give me liberty or give me death, at America's founding in 1776, not one slave was manumitted. As if that were not bad enough, in from 1619 to 1787, the Philadelphia Convention, is a period of 168 years. And when the framers met in Philadelphia, they were concerned about little more than ensuring a stable political order for wealthy white land-owning men who would be able to claim their independence from Britain at the expense of slaves. And this is what happens. For during the Philadelphia Convention, we see that the slave becomes the very condition for the possibility of the United States, that the dehumanization of enslaved Africans is legislated into the very political foundation of America, such that it was the 3/5 compromise. That is to say, the idea that a small northern state like Connecticut would be able to tell a larger slave southern state like Georgia, you have too many people and you can't count your slaves. Georgia said, well, we'll count our slaves as 3/5. And that was a key compromise to the formation of the Constitution of the United States of America. Again, James Baldwin says white people are trapped in a history that they do not understand. Let's travel from 1787 all the way up to 1857. From 1619 to 1857 is a period of 238 years. And it was then that the Supreme Court declared in the Dred Scott decision that whites, African Americans had no rights that whites were bound to respect. And that American history, rightly understood, is the history of a country in which Black people have no place at all. The honesty, as offensive as it is to read the opinion of the Dred Scott decision, its honesty is somewhat refreshing, because in a bizarre way, you see laid bare for the whole country to see that America was not founded with the intention of ever including Black people. So white supremacy is legislated into the very political foundation of America. And despite the fact that we try, as we do here in this forum, and I want to commend our keynote speakers for their excellent work, for their empirical research that helps clarify what Christian nationalism is and what Christianity is. But I think despite the best of our efforts, we have to face a reality that there is something at the core of America that makes America fundamentally incompatible with principles of justice and humanity. And that thing is the reality of white supremacy. As if the Dred Scott decision weren't bad enough, we end up later in the 19th century with the Reconstruction Amendments. And the right to vote was supposedly secured for African Americans in 1870, but it was not really secured until 1965 with the Voting Rights Act. And as if that were not bad enough, in 2013, the Supreme Court of the United States undid the Voting Rights Act. And now we're in a place where we are faced with laws that purport to limit the right to vote. And we're trying to push for legislation to get us back to the position that we were in from 1965 to 2013. And so none of this history is prominent in most discussions of Christian theology. We evade history. You know, I spoke to someone earlier who talked about how problematic it was that we tried to import an American understanding of Adventism into our global missions. And this confuses people in the mission field. And my retort was, I'm more concerned about injecting a global understanding of Adventism into the United States of America as an attempt of white Christians to avoid moral responsibility for the harsh historical realities of white supremacy and how it has played out in the United States. Christian friends, no matter how we want to cut it, Seventh-day Adventism is a uniquely American religious denomination. It was forged in the midst of a civil war that was being fought over what to do with 3.5 million Black slaves. And in addition to being forged in that context, Seventh-day Adventism owes much to the legacy of African-American leadership. I want to close with this thought. Every Seventh-day Adventist in the United States of America, regardless of your race or ethnicity, has the benefit of legal protection under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits religious discrimination in the workplace so that you don't have to make a choice between your conscience and your paycheck. I find it amazing that during the 1950s and 1960s, so much of the Seventh-day Adventist Church and its leadership came out in strong opposition to the church's involvement in protest movements. Indeed, so much so to the point of bringing certain African-American pastors up on disciplinary charges for their participation in helping Black protesters. And yet it seems bizarre to me that on the front end, while we opposed the involvement in protest movements, on the back end, we benefit from the very movements that we opposed. We have a bad habit of reaping where we have not sown. We have a bad habit of evading history in an attempt to perpetuate injustice. One of the most ridiculous commentaries I hear from people is, in one breath, they say things like, the church should not be involved in politics. And then in the next breath, they say, Pastor, do you have my Sabbath accommodation letter? This is a ridiculous juxtaposition because it exposes the sheer hypocrisy of benefiting from a movement on the back end that we opposed on the front end. Christian friends, if we are ever to get a grip on the problems facing us today, we have to come to grips with history. We have to understand that white supremacy is about evading history and perpetuating injustice. Thank you so much for your time. God bless you.